Okay, let's talk about classical conditioning as it was pioneered by Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dog. What's up, dog? Okay, wait, I'm not Randy Jackson. Anyway.
The concept of classical conditioning came about when Ivan Pavlov noticed that when his assistant fed the dogs in the lab, when the assistant was bringing the dog food, the dog salivates, right? And that's a general reaction or response to food. And since salivating is a natural response to food, that would be the unconditioned response. Um, One way to think about it is an unlearned response. It doesn't. The dog does not need to learn to salivate in response to food. It's a natural response. So that's the unconditioned response. So in this case, the food would be the unconditioned stimulus because food is the item that stimulates the response, the natural response. So it's unconditioned or unlearned stimulus. The dog does not need to learn to salivate to food. It's a natural response. So the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and that's an important term in classical conditioning. So let's define it here. An unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a response without prior learning, like the food eliciting the response of the dog salivating. So the dog salivating, that's the unconditioned response. So the formal definition for unconditioned response is a response elicited by the unconditioned stimulus without prior learning. So very simply, the unconditioned stimulus, like food, elicits the unconditioned response, like salivating. Okay, so let me go back to finish the story of Pavlov when he first observed his lab assistant in feeding the dog. Eventually, he observed that after the lab assistant fed the dog many times routinely, um, so the lab assistant walking with the sound of the footsteps, and then the food is given to the dog. So the dog eventually linked the food with the sound of the footsteps of the lab assistant, and Pavlov realized or observed that the salivation actually began at the sound of the footsteps of the lab assistant, even before the food was given to the dog. So eventually, the dog was salivating in response to the sound of the footsteps of the lab assistant. And so, since that's a learned response to the sound of the footsteps, so that would be the conditioned stimulus. Uh, and when the dog salivates only when only the footsteps, the sound of the footsteps are present, then that's the conditioned response. Since that's not a natural response, dogs are not naturally dogs do not naturally salivate at a lab assistant's footsteps. That's been learned or conditioned because it's been conditioned with the food.
So let's look over here on the right side and let me give you the textbook definition of conditioned stimulus. It's a neutral stimulus that, after repeated pairing with an unconditioned stimulus, becomes associated with it and elicits a conditioned response. So A neutral stimulus, as is stated here. The neutral stimulus in this case is the sound of the footsteps of the lab assistant. So before it becomes the conditioned stimulus, it's a neutral stimulus because it originally does not elicit the response of salivating. It's only after it's been conditioned or paired with food, so it's conditioned, that it elicits the response of salivating, then it becomes the conditioned stimulus, eliciting the conditioned response of salivating. Um, so just to make it clear, so after being conditioned, removing the food, just presenting the footsteps, the sound of the footsteps of the lab assistant alone now will elicit the response of salivating because the dog is now conditioned to salivate in response to the footsteps. Again, because the footsteps have been paired with the food for so many times.
And so the formal definition of a conditioned response is a response that comes to be elicited by a conditioned stimulus as a result of its repeated pairing with an unconditioned stimulus. So it should be clear by now. A response like salivating that is now elicited, that can be elicited by the footsteps, which is the conditioned stimulus, because of repeated pairing of the two stimulus of the footsteps and the food. So this initial observation by Pavlov of the lab assistant's footsteps and the food in eliciting salivation. So this initial observation led Pavlov to further experiment, such as with a musical tone. In one of Pavlov's experiments, he used a musical tone as the neutral stimulus. Pavlov used the musical tone C as the neutral stimulus. It's neutral because musical tones do not cause a dog to salivate, so it does not. It's not an unconditioned stimulus because it doesn't cause the natural response of salivation. But he's gonna pair this neutral stimulus. Actually, he did. He paired this neutral stimulus with food, the unconditioned stimulus. So eventually, after it's paired enough times, tone C alone would cause the dog to salivate when the dog hears the tone. So after it's conditioned, it's now the conditioned stimulus. So Pavlov turned this neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. And after being paired enough times, when the musical tone alone elicits salivating, then salivating would be now the conditioned response. Now that you know how certain responses can be conditioned or learned, let me give you the textbook definition for learning. Okay, looking down here, in classical conditioning, learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior, knowledge, capability, or attitude that is acquired through experience and cannot be attributed to illness, injury, or maturation. So pretty much a change behavior in this example, the change in behavior is salivating, and that's acquired through the experience of experiencing it with food. So when it's paired with food enough times, when the musical tone is paired with food enough times, it elicits the change in behavior, in this case salivating, and it's not attributed to any natural responses. Again, salivating is not a natural response to a musical tone. In other cases, natural responses could be change in behavior, or changes attributed to aging, maybe, so that's maturation. So that would not be learning. That would be a natural change in behavior in those cases. In short, learning is how the conditioned response is learned, at least in classical conditioning.